I'm Kevin Sheets. I'm president of the Cortland County Historical Society Board, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you. You braved the elements, although you can sort of hear the elements are still still making themselves known. Thanks for coming tonight. Tonight's talk is part of our series of events that accompanies the exhibit on Lincoln and the Constitution. And if you haven't had a chance yet to see the exhibit, it's right over there. So please take advantage of that. I think there's still some cookies left. So after the talk, you can wander on over there and enjoy the exhibit and a few goodies. The exhibit was created as a national traveling exhibit created by the National Constitution Center with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So that is a very good example of our tax dollars well spent. I would like to thank the Central New York Living History Center for their wonderful partnership with the Historical Society. That partnership has really made possible this exhibit and the series of events that we're enjoying as part of the bicentennial. I'd also like to thank our sponsors who generously helped us with the exhibit and the programs. And I just want to acknowledge them tonight. CFCU, the Credit Union, the Cortland Bookkeeping and Tax Services, Dr. Marissa Clifford and Dr. Stuart Douglas, Hodge Real Estate, Port Cashton and McSherry, Tanner Ibbotson, the Winters Group CPA, the Cortland Veterinary Hospital, Homer Men and Boys, Judd Seals, and O'Connor and Crewman. So thanks so much to all of them for their support. Yes, worthy around the applause. So when Mindy told me that we were able somehow to entice Frank Williams to come to Cortland as part of our Civil War bicentennial celebration, I was a little surprised, delighted, but I was very surprised. It's not every day that you get to rub shoulders with someone of Frank Williams' caliber. The Honorable Frank Williams, Chief, is the retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Rhode Island and is widely regarded as one of the most authoritative Lincoln scholars in the country. He's the author or editor of 14 books, at least 14 books. That's quite impressive, in addition to lots of articles and book chapters and other writing, including a number of books, Lincoln Lessons, Reflections on America's Greatest Leader, and Lincoln as Hero. It sounds like an impossible task, but he's working on an annotated bibliography of all the Lincoln titles published since 1865. Can you imagine? That would daunt anybody, I suspect. Justice Williams was chosen in 2000 to serve on the congressionally authorized Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission and serves on its successor organization, the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. In addition to his distinguished legal career and his scholarship, Justice Williams served our nation as a member of the U.S. Army, earning a Bronze Star, among many other recognitions. Importantly, he was asked to serve by the President on the Military Commission's Review Panel for Tribunals held in Guantanamo Bay, and served as the Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Military Commission Review from 2007 to 2009. I think that's quite impressive. So it's a tremendous honor for me to introduce the Honorable Frank Williams, and I ask you to help me welcome him to Cortland.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and to all of you for coming out. And Martin Sweeney will tell you the last time I was here was 3 springs ago when we had the wet spring. 3, yeah. No, I don't think more than 3, because we had flooding in Rhode Island too. And you had it here, so I bring it with you. I'm sorry. And at 6:45, there was only a handful. And what I was going to do was go and do this talk in the where the exhibit room is, and go to the panel on dissent, which has it's very abbreviated, but very telling about the issues of civil liberties in wartime, which is what I'm going to talk about. So you're going to have to stay with me anyway until the rain is over. So you're also going to have to stay with me because some of this stuff becomes a bit convoluted and complicated because we've been struggling in this republic of ours that we love so much, despite our errors in judgment. There is redemption in this democracy. And there's always been this contest, hasn't there, since our very beginning between civil liberties and security. And that's what we're going through right now with the wars on terror. And and this president has finally admitted that we are at war. That was an issue after 9/11 on whether you can consider these threats from some 50 cell groups. They're getting larger. Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and ISIS, and so there's finally this admission of what risk that we have as a democracy, and I believe it, and it's one reason I volunteered to be. I'm a little too old to take up an M16 again, but. I volunteered to serve on the appellate panel for the Guantanamo commissions, and even while I was the Chief Justice in Rhode Island, that was my contribution. So we live in very trying times. I wish you were protected up here in Cortland County, but we're all at risk. How many veterans here? Thank you for your service. Mine was, and I loved the military exhibit that Mr. Eaton collected. Martin was telling me, Carl and Carol were telling me that Mr. Eaton, the banker, had all of this in his home, and I can relate to that because that's where our collection is. And we have a big one, which someday will go to a school, hopefully, that doesn't have one. And then we'll get a nice treatment and facility like you've done here in Cortland County for the late Mr. Eaton's collection. Anyway, I want to tell you a story about a a fellow veteran of mine who served with me in Southeast Asia in the 60s, and he got pretty banged up and came back with serious issues, both physically and mentally, PTSD, and he got himself back in shape with a lot of faith and effort, and he took up the bagpipe playing for therapy, and he moved to Canada. And he sent me a letter. I wish I had it. I'm going to try to paraphrase it for you. But he sends me a letter saying that, dear Chief, I'm doing a lot of these gigs with the bagpipe, usually at cemetery ceremonies, and I was asked to play at the internment of a homeless vet, and I was glad to do it. And I put my bagpipes in the car, and I got lost on the way to the cemetery. It was in the backwoods, and I finally made it, but it looked like I was too late because the diggers were putting the soil back on into the gravesite, but I got the pipes out and I thought I should play something in this homeless vet's honor, and I began with Amazing Grace, and it was a very moving experience for me because the grave diggers or the diggers were in tears, and and I was crying too, so when it was all over, and I put the pipes back in the car, I heard one of the diggers say, "You know, I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years, and this is the finest event I've ever had. We men are always lost," he writes me. Norman writes me. So, I'm so glad he's recovered. The United States suffers an unexpected attack. The president deploys the armed forces and assumes extraordinary powers that go well beyond what the Constitution seems to allow. Thousands of persons suspected of aiding the enemy are arrested and held without charge, detained, or tried before military tribunals. Talk abounds of deporting members of a particular ethnic group from the country. The president meets frequently with evangelical ministers, trying to assure their active support for his military conflict as an epic struggle between good and evil, inspired by the country's divinely appointed mission to spread freedom and democracy throughout the world. Today? Post 9/11? No. The period is the 1860s, and the president is, of course, our Abraham Lincoln. And I do hope you see the exhibit here. It's been in Rhode Island as it's traveled around the last 3 or 4 years. And of course, the conflict is the American Civil War. History never really repeats itself, but the uncanny resemblances between that era and the events, as I alluded to earlier, in our country since September 11th, 2001, have pushed to the forefront of historical discussions questions as to the status of individual rights in a national emergency and the permissible limits on the rule of law in wartime. So I hope this is edifying for you in a way of how, is there any question that Lincoln is still our greatest president? We pray for another one like him. We certainly need him, or more than one, to lead us. He's always provided a lens through which Americans examine themselves, and every generation reinvents Lincoln in its own image. He has been variously described as a consummate moralist and a shrewd political operator, a lifelong foe of slavery, and even as an inveterate racist. The detention of enemy combatants at Guantanamo and President Bush's decision to allow military tribunals has spawned much heated discussion worldwide.
That's a tornado warning.
I got that too on the car coming up. You see what I bring to Cortland County? Right?
Just don't come in the winter, please.
So should I? I couldn't get out of Rhode Island in the winter. We had such a tough, like you, such a very bitter, tough winter. Can I speak now, or do we go to the tornado shelter in the basement of this wonderful facility? Then we're doomed. Oh, yeah, good. Then you're stuck with me for a long time. So we do know that candidate Obama, now the president, and his people were intent on closing the Guantanamo facilities. They still are. In fact, Senator McCain, who himself was detained at the Hanoi Hilton, is keen on closing Guantanamo. But the president, the current president, as his predecessor, is reviving the use of military commissions. Keep in mind, we have the civil processes that I was a strong part of as a Superior Court judge and Chief Justice, and then we have the military law, which is where you've got armed force personnel and these detainees and terrorists that are being handled in a military system. And this is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on. The law of war and the use of tribunals have been going on for several hundred years. So in making the choice between tribunals and the civil processes, we walk a fine line between protecting the civil liberties we all hold so dear and guarding the safety of our country's citizens. And Bush and Obama are not the first to employ the use of tribunals. Neither are they the first to be the target of criticism for this decision. They both tread the same waters as did our Abraham Lincoln, and both have been accused of forsaking civil liberties. In fact, President Obama, I think unfairly, has been accused of violating civil liberties by his same liberal base. And yet, I think he, as commander-in-chief and the one who takes the oath of office, the only office with a prescribed oath right in the Constitution to preserve and protect. Yes? So our leaders, many times in our history, have been criticized for taking extra constitutional measures. And closer examination, I think, demonstrates how the many parallels between then, this horrific civil war, and today. So we have presidents who face emergencies. Lincoln was facing rebellion. He called it a rebellion. He never would recognize the Confederate States of America. He would call them the Confederacy, so-called. Where's that coming from, by the way?
It's coming from the phone.
You can shut it off.
It's coming from the phone. But I have mine off.
Only if you see the rattle of the building do we stop. Do we stop? So we had a professor and author, James G. Randall, who taught at the University of Illinois in the 30s and 40s, and he wrote many books on Lincoln, who describes Lincoln's actions this way: no president has carried the power of presidential edict and executive order independently of Congress so far as he did, Lincoln. It would not be easy to state what Lincoln conceived to be the limit of his powers. Now, I want to stop here for a second because of my deep respect and affection for the 16th president. I started studying Lincoln when I was 11 in the 6th grade. And when I was 13, I wanted to become a lawyer because Lincoln was a lawyer, not knowing what lawyers did when I was 13. Some days I still don't know what lawyers do. But I've come. My respect for him has only increased exponentially because I just don't think there has ever been a person in a leadership position in our republic that could multitask as he did, that could have the political courage, and I mean political in the best sense of the word, as he did, and also at the same time have empathy for the people he was leading, including those in the South, our fellow countrymen, he would call them. And the brilliance of the man, with 1 year's formal education, probably equivalent, the latest analysis, and I'm not really an educator, is that it was equivalent to a 6th grade education. The rest of it was all autodidactic. He was self-taught and would read that. So how does this happen? This is a guy who on the 8th Judicial Circuit, where he practiced law in central Illinois, 3 months in the spring, 3 months in the fall, the circuit that he would ride with in a caravan of lawyers behind Judge David Davis. He reads and gets to comprehend the 6 books of Euclidean geometry. He's in his 30s. How can this happen? And then he's able to multitask as our president and commander-in-chief and lead us through this Civil War. But at the beginning of that war, after the firing on Fort Sumter, call it the 80 days between April 1861, where he gave his first call for troops, and the convening of Congress. Congress was not in session at the time. And that normally it's a new Congress, and at that time the timeline was you have elections in November, the president is sworn in on March 4th, but the new Congress would not take office until that following fall, so it would have been the fall of '61. But because of the war, Lincoln called a special session for July 4th, 1861. And in that interregnum, the 80 days, he performed a whole series of important acts by sheer assumption of presidential power. You see, there's a willfulness in this guy, a willfulness, but it's for good. That's the resilience, the willfulness for good. He would do everything to accomplish his mission, which initially, as we all know, was to reunify. The freedom part of it would evolve until he decided in '62 to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a panel on that too. He increases the size of the Army and Navy, appropriates money for the purchase of arms and ammunition, declares a blockade of the southern coast, which is an act of war, which in a way is a de facto recognition of a belligerent nation. And of course he suspends the precious privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, which is the right of, and when I was on the Superior Court every day, I would sign the writ of habeas corpus, which is a list of those incarcerated at our state prison to appear before me the next day to have their detention checked. That's what we take for granted as Americans, is the right to have our imprisonment reviewed, suspended. Now, all these things I just said, and this isn't a civics quiz, but who has the power and authorization to do this? I didn't hear you. The Congress. The Congress. They're the ones, arguably, there's an argument on the writ of habeas corpus, whether it's either or. But it's Congress, and they were not in session, so the president does it. Now, the suspension of habeas corpus triggered, as you can imagine, the most heated and serious constitutional disputes of the Lincoln administration. Because the suspension, it wasn't just keeping an American citizen in what anti-Lincoln administration people, and there were many, called the Bastilles of the North, Fort Lafayette, which was at the bottom of the Hudson across from the Battery in New York, Camp Douglas in Chicago, Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, Fort Delaware on the Delaware River near Wilmington. It was what habeas corpus suspension led to, the use of military commissions, martial law. Every district in the North had a provost marshal. In the North, these were not states that had seceded. Provost marshals present to ensure the draft when it was adopted by Lincoln and the Congress in '63, that people would respond to the draft. And they would, and the South did the same thing with their draft. So Lincoln proclaims, this is very early on, not civil war in those words, and this is his message to the Congress on July 4th, but the existence of combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Right? Now we're talking my judicial proceedings, the civil. He calls forth the militia to suppress said combinations, which he orders to disperse and retire peacefully to their homes. We all know that only Congress is constitutionally empowered to declare war, but suppression of rebellion has been recognized as an executive function. That's why the Attorney General's Department is within the Article 2 part of our Constitution, the executive branch, for which the prerogative of setting aside civil procedures has been placed in the President's hands. We've all talked about whether or not this war on terror is really a war, that issue has consumed much public discourse, and I think brought our citizens to a new level of political awareness. Abraham Lincoln was no exception, because in part of the criticism, Lincoln's style of leadership provides the quintessential formula for great leadership and political courage. Despite all the acts he took as president, he invariably ranks first in all the presidential polls, sometimes tied with Washington, usually Lincoln, Washington, FDR. And it's pretty amazing to me, because these surveys are really prepared and conducted by the liberal academic communities. So now we have all these acts taken by Lincoln in early 1861, and we've got problems because Washington is surrounded by Virginia and Maryland, right? That's our nation's capital. And after a few days after Lincoln's call for troops, Virginia secedes. Maryland, which is a slaveholding state, is very pro-South and is recruiting soldiers to fight not for the federal government, but for the Confederacy. And what runs through Maryland to get to Washington? The railroad, as well as the telegraph lines for communications to the north, right? So Lincoln argues that events forced his decision to suspend the writ of habeas corpus on April 19th, that's 7 days after Fort Sumter. The 6th Massachusetts Militia arrives in Washington after having literally fought its way through hostile Baltimore. On April 20, Marylanders severed railroad communications with the North, almost isolating Washington from that part of the nation for which it remained the capital. And you know, Lincoln did have a temper. And you could see it in Spielberg's Lincoln when he's getting some feedback, pushback by people who were disputing whether he shouldn't participate in peace negotiations with the South and give up emancipation in so doing. And he needed the votes, like 4 more votes in the House to get the 13th Amendment through. And remember, who didn't see the movie? I'll send you my Netflix copy. And remember that scene where he says, where they're quibbling and cobbling and whining, and he, I am the President of the United States, empowered with immense responsibility. Now go get those votes. My kind of guy. So he's apoplectic, and he has no information about the whereabouts of the other troops promised him by northern governors. Almost every state in the North had oversubscribed to Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. He had no place to put them anyway, or train them. So on the 24th of April, Lincoln tells the Massachusetts Volunteers, the 6th, "I don't believe there is any North. The 7th Regiment is a myth." New York, 7th. "Rhode Island, the 1st, is not known in our geography any longer. You are the only northern realities." But on April 25, the 7th New York finally reaches Washington after again struggling through Maryland. And the right of habeas corpus, remember, Lincoln's the lawyer, right? 24 years in practice, very respectful of our Constitution and the writ of habeas corpus. So it was so important that the president actually considered the possible bombardment of Maryland cities as an alternative to suspension of the writ, having authorized General Winfield Scott, then the commander of the Army, in case of necessity to bombard the cities, but only in the extremest necessity was Scott to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And Scott did suspend it on the president's authority on the rail lines running from Washington to Philadelphia so the troops could come through. And Lincoln met with some Maryland officials to avoid the confrontations taking place in Baltimore, so they began using sidewheelers to bring troops around the state to Annapolis and by train into Washington to try to keep Maryland in the Union and to try to keep peace in this border slave state. So, but in the state of Maryland, there was this dissatisfied American named John Merriman, who was a gentleman farmer with some means, the family with some wealth, and he dissented from the course being charted by Lincoln in both word and deed, and he spoke up vigorously against the Union and in favor of the South. He destroyed telegraph lines and bridges. Thus, he not only exercised his constitutional right to disagree with the government, but engaged in these acts of treason, really. So the young man's actions precipitated the first legal conflict between the president and that great Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Brooke Tawney. I'm being sarcastic. Tawney was, remember, the author of the majority opinion in Dred Scott in 1857, in which he says the black man have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Very pro-South. He was a slave owner but freed his slaves, and he also believed in the right of states to secede. But that's for another thunderstorm. So on the end of May, the 25th, Merriman is arrested by the military and lodged in Fort McHenry, Baltimore, for various acts of treason. And shortly after Merriman's arrest, and if I were his counsel, I would do the same thing, he seeks a writ of habeas corpus from the Chief Justice, alleging that Merriman was being illegally held at Fort McHenry. Now, why the Chief? Because the Chief Justice, we didn't have circuit court judges, federal circuit court judges then, so each of the Supreme Court justices had a circuit. And Tawney was riding this circuit that covered Baltimore, which in Maryland was his home. So he issues a writ to the fort commander, George Cadwalader, another lawyer, by the way, now in uniform, directing him to produce Merriman before the court the next day. Cadwalader refuses on the ground that President Lincoln had authorized the suspension. To Tawney, this was constitutional blasphemy. He immediately issues an attachment for Cadwalader's body, seized the body, U.S. Marshals, for contempt. But the marshal could not enter the fort. Right? I wouldn't let him in either to serve the attachment. So the old justice recognized the impossibility of enforcing his order. It's a good thing the judicial branch does not have the military under its control. Settles back, and he produces the now famous Chambers opinion, Ex parte Merriman. I don't know if if the panel specifically mentions this case, but this is a Chambers opinion now. This is from one justice. It's not an opinion of the full court. That's important. Notwithstanding the fact that he was in his 85th year, the Chief Justice vigorously defended the power of Congress alone to suspend the writ. The Chief took this position in part because permissible suspension was in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which is the section relating to congressional duties. He ignores the fact that it was placed there by the Committee on Drafting at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 as a matter of form, not substance. They didn't know where to put this exception to the writ. The writ's guaranteed except in cases of rebellion or invasion or when the public safety requires it. So you can suspend it. The question is who has the power, the President or the Congress? The amazing thing about his ex parte Merriman is that nowhere does he acknowledge that a rebellion was in progress and that the fate of the nation and the state of Maryland were at stake. Tawney misses the crucial point made in the draft of Lincoln's report to Congress on July 4th. This is Lincoln. The whole of the laws which were required to be faithfully executed were being resisted and failing of execution in nearly 1/3 of the states. Must they be allowed to finally fail of execution? Are all the laws but one, habeas corpus, go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated? This would be Lincoln's rationale throughout the war, that he considered justification for all of the acts he took to suppress the rebellion. And some of the acts by his administration and his military were draconian, including the detention and trial of U.S. citizens by court-martial. By addressing Congress, Lincoln had ignored Tawney. Now remember, Tawney's issuing this opinion, ex parte Merriman. Lincoln does the smart political thing. He doesn't make his temper overcome him. So he waits until Congress comes to that July 4th special session when he gives this address explaining to the Congress why he took all these acts and ask them, you tell me what to do. Ratify them, not, give me some other direction. Very smart politically. Of course, we're at war, and the Congress is going to ratify his actions, and they did, including the suspension of habeas corpus. Nothing more was done about Merriman at the time. He did get out of jail. There were feeble attempts to put it down for trial, but as in so many cases during the whole war, the fluid nature of citizenship and acts and loyalties never was tried. Congress did ratify the president's actions, and in 1862, Congress resolved the ambiguity in the Constitution and permitted the president the right to suspend the writ nationwide while the rebellion continued. Lincoln never denied that he had stretched his presidential power. These measures, he declared, whether strictly legal or not, were ventured upon under what appeared to be a popular demand and a public necessity, trusting then as now that Congress would readily ratify them. That's in the president's July 4th message. But what he did, as the brilliant politician that he was he confronts Congress with a fait accompli. And it was the case of the president deliberately exercising legislative power and then seeking congressional ratification after the event. There remained individuals who adamantly believed that in doing so he had exceeded his authority. Now, this would be so during the whole war. And when you think of Lincoln's reelection, I know I'm jumping ahead here, but I want you to stay with me and think about this animosity toward him, the dissent toward him. Lincoln wins all the electoral votes except New Jersey, which was the home of George B. McClellan, his Democratic opponent. This is re-election, 1864. The vote is 2,200,000 for him and 1,800,000 against him. Well, every time you read that in some text or treatise, it's an amazing victory. But you know what sticks out in my mind? How do you account for the 1.8 million people? What were they thinking? They were not happy campers. That's a big number in a civil war. So I want to talk about another major character that was so much against Lincoln and his policies and his administration. Former Congressman Clement Laird Vallandigham, and I think most of you have heard. He was quite an orator. He was running, this is 63, probably the best known anti-war copperhead of the Civil War. That's those anti-Lincoln, pro-Southern Democrats mostly. And probably the president's sharpest critic. He charged Lincoln with the wicked and hazardous experiment of calling the people to arms without counsel and authority of Congress, with suspending the writ of habeas corpus, and with coolly coming before the Congress and pleading that he was only preserving and protecting the Constitution and demanding and expecting the thanks of Congress and the country for his usurpations of power. Vallandigham was speaking at a Democratic mass meeting at Mount Vernon, Ohio. He's running for governor, when he was arrested by Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, a Rhode Islander. Some wag said to me, "Chief, if Rhode Island didn't have that great Revolutionary War hero, second only to Washington, Nathaniel Greene, you'd be stuck with General Burnside as your..." Or Byrne, as McClellan called him. I think they were classmates at West Point. So what happens is Burnside is the military governor of that district. I told you we had these provosts and military heads in all these areas in the north, and his area was Ohio, where he was stationed, Burnside, and he issues this general order against attacking the president or Union policy, and that's what Vallandigham was doing. So based on this order, like where is the First Amendment here? Based on this order, he has Vallandigham arrested, takes him to a military prison, Kemper Barracks in Cincinnati, and he's tried almost the next day by a military commission. He's found guilty, and he's sentenced to imprisonment for the duration of the war. So his lawyers seek a writ of habeas corpus from the United States Supreme Court and ask them to review this conviction, process, suspension. And in ex parte Vallandigham, his application was denied on the grounds that the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction over a military tribunal. And that's been pretty much the state of legal involvement in these kinds of cases until Guantanamo and 9/11, where our Supreme Court has been very active, as has Congress and the President, which was not the case during the Civil War. So what happens is, there are these anti-war Democrats that I mentioned, copperheads, but they're also war Democrats. Democrats who didn't vote for Lincoln, but were against secession and support the administration on the ground for reunion. And some of them were hacked off that over the Landingham case because it was a cause célèbre. He was a famous American legislator. He's running for governor. It does appear to be a First Amendment issue, speaking out against the war and the administration. Arrested, convicted, confined. So there are rallies all over the country. One was in Albany, New York, right? And with Erastus Corning, your railroad guy, and other stuff, who writes for the Committee of War Democrats, complaining about the arrest and conviction of Landingham, especially by military commission. And they expressed loyalty to the Union, but had censured the Lincoln administration for what it called unconstitutional acts. To the Albany Democrats' claims that they supported the use of every constitutional and lawful measure to suppress the rebellion. That's in Corning's letter to Lincoln. Lincoln is going to respond now, and it is mentioned on the panel in there. And it's the Landingham letter the Erastus Corning letter that was done it not only was published in newspapers, but in pamphlet form, which was a common way of getting the word out. 500,000 to 1 million copies of Lincoln's response to the concerns of the Albany Democrats. Lincoln replies that he had not knowingly employed any other measure that was not constitutional. So the Albany Democrats invoke the safeguards and guarantees for the liberties of citizens under the Constitution, observing that, just like Tawney in Merriman, were secured substantially to the English people after years of protracted civil war and were adopted into our Constitution at the end of the Revolution. Lincoln replies that their point would have been stronger had they said that these safeguards had been adopted and applied during the Civil Wars and during our Revolution, rather than after the one and at the end of the other. I too, said Lincoln, am devotedly for them after Civil War and before Civil War and at all times. That is the safeguarding of civil liberties, like writ of habeas corpus, except when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require their suspension. Lincoln then argues in this Corning letter that those who wish to destroy the Constitution were relying on the fact that the government would, in great degree, be restrained by the same Constitution and law from arresting their progress. If anything, Lincoln continues, he waited too long to implement emergency measures. Thoroughly imbued with a reverence for the guaranteed rights of individuals, I was slow to adopt the strong measures which by degree I have been forced to do as being within the exceptions of the Constitution and as indispensable to the public safety. The core of Lincoln's argument was that the courts of justice, our civil courts now, are incompetent to handle cases arising out of a vast emergency. Suspension of habeas corpus is the constitutional provision that applies in such cases. The drafters of the Constitution, he continued, understood that there were emergency instances in which, again Lincoln, men may be held in custody whom the courts, acting on ordinary rules, would discharge. This is almost like a preventive detention. And even Obama has indicated a predilection to explore this if this war on terror gets out of hand. Habeas corpus does not discharge those proved to be guilty of a defined crime. That's your preventive detention. The Constitution permits its suspension that, again, Lincoln, that men may be arrested and held who cannot be proved to be guilty of a defined crime, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. This is because in times of emergency, arrests must sometimes be made not for what has been done, but to prevent things that probably would be done. Lincoln pointed out that a number of still high-ranking Confederates whose sentiments were then known were in power of the government, were members of the federal government at the time the rebellion broke out. Had they been seized, the rebellion would be weaker. But none of them had committed a crime then defined in law, so would have been discharged on the basis of habeas corpus if the writ were permitted to operate. In view of these and similar cases, I think I shall be blamed for having made too few arrests than too many. Now, Mark Neely, who's a friend of you know Mark Martin, good. He wonderful scholar, just retired from Penn State. In '91, he wrote this book, The Fate of Liberty: Abraham Lincoln and Civil Liberties in Wartime. And Mark, who's just an outstanding scholar, goes to the National Archives as part of his research, and he tries to discern how many citizens were detained for an hour or a day or months, or so you can't. The records are such that he could only get probative evidence of 14,000, but other estimates have, and these are U.S. citizens now, not Confederates, not military, 14,000 to 28,000 U.S. citizens. This is a population, remember, of 30 million north and south, the 1860 census. So it's a big number. And 4,300 of them are tried by military tribunal of these U.S. citizens that are detained. So his actions, he continues, were constitutional whenever the public safety required. So the Albany Democrats also criticizes the arrest and trial of AntiWar Democratic Congressman Clement Vallandigham merely for his words. But Lincoln replied that Vallandigham was encouraging, and he was, desertion from the army upon which the nation was depending to save the Union. He noted that the Albany Democrats support the suppression of the rebellion by force, but this depends on an army. And one of the biggest problems armies face is desertion. Remember how many were court-martialed, young soldiers sleeping on sentry duty, and a weeping mother goes to the executive mansion asking for a pardon for the sleeping sentinel? And generals in the field were gaga when the president interfered with their discipline. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts while I must not touch a hair of the wily agitator who induces him to desert? That's Lincoln, not me. Lincoln says that if he's wrong on the question of his constitutional power, his error is in believing that certain actions that are not constitutional in peacetime, in the absence of a rebellion, become constitutional when those conditions exist. In other words, that the Constitution is not in its application in all respects the same in cases of rebellion or invasion involving the public safety as it is in times of profound peace and public security. And one reason we trust this guy is because when he saw the war coming to an end after his re-election in 1864, he began to let up with his commanding generals in the field on habeas corpus, that is, the arrests and the trials of civilians by military commission. So he was a man of his words. He wanted us to return to the peacetime processes and protocol that we so much believe in and rely on. As noted above, Lincoln argued that the means appropriate for an emergency are not appropriate for normal times. A sick man is given medicine that would not be good for a well one. Lincoln's argument here is what I call quintessentially prudent. He practiced prudence. Of course, after the war, about a year after the war, in 1866, the Supreme Court addressed this issue in Ex parte Milligan, where it held, and Landon Milligan was a copperhead in Indiana, clearly treasonous, and convicted, sentenced to death. There were stays, appeals to the Supreme Court. They finally got to it, and the court says military commissions could be used only when the civil courts were not operating, which is not the case in Indiana. The civil courts were. Not even if the charge was fomenting an armed uprising in a time of civil war. But what it also said is that the Congress could provide for these kinds of military commissions in wartime. In 1942, the United States Supreme Court in Ex parte Quirin, these were the German saboteurs that were dropped off on the Atlantic seaboard, right, to destroy our infrastructure. And they were tried by military commission per order of the President Roosevelt, and they were convicted, and all but one, I think, were executed. And their appeal was denied by the Supreme Court when they said, as in Landingham, that military tribunals are not courts in the sense of the Judiciary Article 3 of the Constitution. Rather, they are the military's administrative bodies to determine the guilt of declared enemies and pass judgment on them. So, as we were during Lincoln's era, we are once again a nation at war. And as I've tried to show in just using a couple of examples, Merriman and Landingham, the laws of war are different. I know that this is a difficult concept to grasp because most people today are not used to thinking in terms of wartime and peacetime. Think about this. We lost the new number now of deaths north and south of military is 750,000, up from 620. Now, if you were to prorate that, population of 30 million, 750,000. Today we're 300 million. So if we were to do a quotient passing a century later, you're talking 7.5 million people. 7.5 million soldiers dead using today's population. So how many could we lose, even if it's 750, which is 750,000, which is an amazing number? How many could we lose in one day or one morning if Manhattan was hit with a chemical or biological or nuclear suitcase bomb? And that's what they want to do. Go to their websites, the terrorist websites, and see what their mission is. Their avowed mission is to destroy us. Regardless of military, they're talking men and women and children not in uniform. So let me close, by the way, when someone says, let me close, or I'm concluding, beware, because they're giving you false hope that they're coming to the end of the talk. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Fate of Liberty, the one I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, maybe it was an hour ago, I don't know. Mark Neely closes by admitting the clearest lesson, this is in his epilogue, 10 years before 9/11, the clearest lesson is that there is no clear lesson in war, no neat precedents, no ground rules, no map. War and its effect on civil liberties remains a frightening unknown. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming out in the tornado warnings and leaving your kayaks at the entrance. Questions from anybody? Yes.
You know, as you've been talking, it's made me recall the detention of the Japanese people and ironically, another well-loved president, right, FDR.
And Governor Warren of California, who later became the very liberal Chief Justice, Earl Warren, appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, who of course led a very liberal court and was responsible for having like 2 votes, 2 hearings on Brown versus Board of Education, the integration of our schools. But at the time now, he's the wartime governor of California. But go ahead.
So I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the consensus would be that there were no traitors amongst those people, that was highly a very unfounded kind of action to take. And I'm not equating that to the 14 to 28,000, but has anybody, including you, ever kind of even ventured a guess as to how many of those people were actually complicit with the overthrow of the government?
Yes, some have, and it's hard. The records are not complete to really determine the actions of arrest, detention, no habeas, trial by military commission, and whether there were many that were clearly involved. I mentioned Lambden Milligan. I mean, we know that. Merriman. I mean, these people, you know, they were treasonous, and many were. I have a couple of points on the Japanese internments. It's a shameful blot, but keep in mind, you know, one of the things about historical evaluation is that we've got to judge within the context of the times in which the events take place. And what had happened, you know, with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and all the other stuff. And there were other examples of detention, even in World War I, of German Americans, and Italians. And so this isn't the first time. I doubt if you don't see any effort, for example, under George W. Bush to inter Muslims, do you? And he went out of his way to, I think, forcefully and sincerely to not blame a whole ethnic group on those responsible for 9/11 and other terror. Maybe we've come a long way since the Civil War, but it's very hard to judge a leadership decision unless we're wearing the shoes and the threat is real. Yes.
I grew up on the West Coast during the Second World War, and the younger generation were very upset when one Japanese family that we had in the community disappeared overnight. And the rationale given then was that it was for their protection from being used as a, what would you say? Scapegoat. Well, that they would have relatives in Japan who would ask them to do treasonous things.
Yeah.
And it was really better that they should be removed to a place where that was not possible than to have people who were perfectly innocent used as
conduits,
Yeah.
or as agents.
yeah, whatever that.
Yeah, and this was, did you all hear that she was a young California girl when this... Oregon. Well, but the same thing. In Oregon, Washington, California, they had these camps
Yeah.
to inter and all these Japanese, these Nisei, really, Japanese Americans born here, many born here, but they had relatives in Japan, the Empire of Japan, and there was a fear that they would be used as sleeper agents and not so. How do you feel about it now?
They never came back.
No, but how do you feel about the policy at the time, now that you're mature?
Well, I think they had a point there. This was also the one place that was actively shelled during the war. It was right at the mouth of the Columbia River. There was a fort there, and they sent a submarine over there to shell the fort. Well, the submarine parked out beyond and started shelling, and they decided not to return the shelling because it would give the Japanese the spot that they could actually identify that they were in the right place. And this was a very controversial order to be given. But anyway, eventually they stopped shelling, and the submarine remained there. And it stayed there all night, and nothing else happened. And afterwards, they finally left, and the reason was that they disregarded the movement of the tides, and when they had finished shelling, they were stuck.
Good. It couldn't happen to find a bunch of people at the time. Can you tell us what your age was in Oregon when this was all happening?
I was in high school.
Certainly old enough to know what was going on.
Yeah, the war ended the year that I was a senior in high school.
Yeah, so that's 45,
Yeah.
August of 45.
Yeah, but-
At least August for the Japanese Empire.
But they were really expecting invasion.
Yes?
We lived out on the coast. We had a daffodil farm there. And we came home from school one day, and there was a machine gun emplacement up by our garage and an anti-aircraft thing by the road to our fields.
Well, that's true, and it's also true where I live in Rhode Island on the East Coast. All of the beachfront land in my little state and Massachusetts and all along the coast was seized by the federal government for defense purposes. Coastal patrols, barbed wire, and bunkers, all, artillery emplacements that had crossfire. It was a very real concern that the Germans, in this case, would attack on the, and we had submarine attacks too. Some German U-boats were sunk very close to our shore in Rhode Island. So, it's another reason why we need to look at the situation at the time it existed. Yes.
We had to pull the shades on our living rooms here so that the enemy planes couldn't see the light.
Yeah, blackout.
Yeah. Blackout, sure. I get it. Yes.
Right, but when the Japanese were interned, didn't they take their property? There was-
No, they took suitcases, that's it.
No, but
I mean, now there were reparations. They were supposed to, but I don't know, I'm not an expert on that, but there were reparations that were supposedly made at the end of the war. But it was traumatic for the Nisai, and to be uplifted from their homes and businesses and placed in the desert or these arid places that are now historic sites. Anyone else? Yes,
I
Ma.
comment that when I taught 8th grade American history, I think the most challenging concept to get across was the paradoxical philosophy that Lincoln obviously understood, that you sometimes have to violate the Constitution in order to guarantee that we will continue to have a union and a Constitution. But for 8th graders, and maybe for people my age, with their head wrapped around that, is a very challenging thing. We look at it in terms of black and white, not so much the shades of gray. And that just amazes me, and I guess maybe 8th graders eventually understood. What if, they're very good at what if, 8th graders, what if we hadn't had as a 16th president a man who was not a political opportunist, military opportunist, take advantage of the situation to truly become a dictator? It was there, but he did not. And that man's integrity is just what blows me away.
I agree with you, Martin. I agree with you because Don Fehrenbacher, the late Don Fehrenbacher, who was just a wonderful person, World War II navigator on B-17s, great professor at Stanford, wrote some wonderful book, Lincoln's Prelude to Greatness. But in one article that I use in my classroom at the Naval War College, Fehrenbacher, who admires Lincoln like we do, said that what Lincoln did was not a good lesson for future presidents who did not have the same kind of character and integrity that Lincoln did. And he's right. He's right. So isn't the responsibility us? It's like the pogo in the comic strip. We have met the enemy and they are us because we're the ones who elect these beauties. Oh, excuse me, these candidates. And really, and this is an old judge's opinion, and I was saying to someone, was it you outside? It's like the candidates, I'm not going to say for which office, but it's like the clown bus pulled up. And all the clowns are getting out. Am I right on this or what? It's mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Every one of them couldn't come up to Abraham Lincoln's ankle. And I'm not being political here when I say this. It does. When you're my age, you become pretty apolitical, especially as a judge. We're not supposed to, and we leave our politics at the court. We don't elect our judges in Rhode Island. It's a merit selection system, so we don't have to campaign for terms, which we like because we can be more independent, more of an independent judiciary. Well, thank you all very much. You've been great.